My name is Liz Fuller, and I'm an advisor to Big Tent USA. And at Big Tent, we're steadfast in our commitment to defending our democratic values, our Constitution, and the rule of law. Our goal is to empower you with facts, guidance, and calls to action so you can become a stronger and more effective advocate. One thing you can do right now is to urge your senators to vote no on the big, horrible bill. Our partner, Protect Our Winters, has an easy to use vote no on reconciliation letter to send to your respective senators. The link to that letter will be sent to you to all attendees together with a recap of this evening's conversation. We are honored to welcome Andra Watkins and David Graham to Big Tent to discuss Project 2025, the Right's Blueprint for the Acquisition of Power. David is a staff writer at The Atlantic and an author of the Atlantic Daily Newsletter. He is the author of a new book, The Project. He won the Toner Prize for Excellence in National Political Reporting in 2021 for his coverage of the 2020 presidential election. He previously reported for Newsweek, The Daily Beast, and The Wall Street Journal. He is also an adjunct instructor of journalism at Duke University, near to my heart, and lives in Durham, North Carolina. Andra describes herself as a proud immigrant and a survivor of Christian nationalism. She's the author of the bestselling Substack, For Such a Time as This, formerly How Project 2025 Will Ruin Your Life, and her New York Times bestselling memoir, Not Without My Father, One Woman's 444-mile walk of the Natchez Trace, was published in 2019. So David and Andra, welcome to the Big Tent. To get us started and to set the stage, can each of you briefly explain what Project 2025, admittedly a many-headed hydra, is, and why Americans who care about democracy should be paying attention right now?
Yeah, I can start off and sort of give the sort of narrow view, and I think Andra can give some of the ideological underpinning, maybe. Um, Project 2025 is a project that was undertaken by the Heritage Foundation, the long-running conservative think tank in Washington, in 2022, and the goal was to set a plan for the next conservative president and to provide a sort of policy platform, to provide staffing for that. They created a database of, they say, 10,000 people who they had sort of identified and trained up, and to create a 100-day plan. And I think what is notable about Project 2025, a few things. One is how successful it's been. I think it's proven to be a really useful way of understanding what the Trump administration is doing and a good predictor of what they do. I also think it's interesting because unlike a lot of these plans, which I think we see from think tanks on both sides of the aisle every 4 years, this isn't just a kind of wish list of policies. Um, it's also a really careful plan for how to achieve them. There's people who've thought very deeply about government and thought very deeply about how they can take it over and put it to their own ends. And I think that makes it really important and really effective, and as a result, very dangerous to our democracy. The last thing I'd say is so much of what they want to do is to consolidate power at the executive branch, to grab power that the president has not previously had, and to vest it with that one person, which I think makes it dangerous for American democracy. It also has a really broad, I think, ideological project behind it, and I think Andra can speak to that more eloquently than me.
Yes, so I grew up in a Christian nationalist church and school in the moral majority 70s and 80s in rural South Carolina. So I started writing about Project 2025 in January of 2024 on Substack because I picked it up in late 2023 and started reading it and started seeing very quickly by page 3 buried Bible verses in the text that I had been forced to memorize in that world, and concepts and dogma that were very familiar to me, even though when I deconstructed from that and said, yay, I never have to think about this again, I thought I never would, and now I sit and talk about it all the time. So yay me. But it is packed with this Christian nationalist underpinnings, and they underpin the 4 promises. Those are tied to specific Bible concepts. The Heritage Foundation is primarily staffed, but not exclusively staffed, by Opus Dei, Catholic, religious extremists, and they have those connections, but there are also Protestant and Dominionist-based Christian nationalists. If people have questions about that, I can talk about it. I've talked about it extensively on my Substack. But I've called Project 2025 from the beginning a Christo-fascist manifesto to transform our government into a Christian nationalist theocracy. And so each of the 4 promises about the family, about living the good life and enjoying the blessings of liberty, and about immigration and people being here are all underpinned. There's another one, or they're all underpinned with Bible verses that I was forced to learn when I was in that world. So it was really horrifying to me to pick that up and see all of that in there and think I got away from that. And now we're all going to be forced to live in that again. Christian nationalists very much believe, whatever strain of it they are, that the Bible should be the basis of our laws. And so a lot of what you see and what they're doing in red states and have been doing for a while in red states, but what informs Project 2025 is this notion that the Bible is God's perfect law. Our laws should be drawn from that. Any laws that violate a Christian nationalist interpretation of that law should be ignored and overturned. And so you have a group of politicians now that have come up for 50 years who will not compromise, will not work across the aisle, are very rigid and really horrifyingly stuck in how they want to accomplish things. And so it's a very interesting moment to live. And that's how I've interpreted Project 2025 as I've written about it.
I'm curious, Andra, like thinking about how this is the same or different from what we've seen before. What about this is to you is new, and what about this seems like a continuation of currents that have been going for a long time?
The goal of taking over the government and making a Christian nationalist government was something that my pastor talked about when I was in elementary school in South Carolina. So this has been a long-standing goal of Christian nationalism. I mean, they published the first mandate for leadership in 1979. Ronald Reagan, and you talked about this in your book, implemented 60-some% of it in his administration. And so every time they wrote a new one, they moved things to the right. And they did that every 4 years. They used states like Missouri and Oklahoma and Texas, places that a lot of Americans just really don't pay attention to, as petri dishes for how to attack certain aspects of this thing. And then they would inform, I think, their rewrites of that to try to accomplish a moving further to the right. So this is something that they've worked on for a long time. I think they looked at demographics and predictions about demographics and realized that if they didn't accomplish this in the next 2 or 3 years, they were going to be demographically challenged. And so Project 2025 to me was their Hail Mary. We've got to get this done, and we've got to do it this year. You may feel differently about that, but that's how I read it.
No, I think that's right. I thought when you read the text, and also when you read writings by the sort of architects of Project 2025, or listen to speeches by them, or listen to interviews, there's this very apocalyptic tone in it, and sometimes that is expressed in more political terms. They'll talk about we're in the late stages of a Marxist takeover, but sometimes I think it's in more religious terms. A couple other things I was thinking while you were talking. One is, I don't know if people watched the interview or watched clips of the interview between Tucker Carlson and Ted Cruz. I guess it was last night, and it was floating around today. But Cruz makes, is citing the Bible, and Carlson challenges him to name the verse, and Cruz is caught flat-footed, doesn't know what he's doing. That's not something I think you would see with Russell Vought. And it's striking when you listen to Vought. I mean, he will cite specific verses. He knows his Bible well. He is a devout person in that way. I think it's interesting also, it was something they've been doing, something that conservative Christians have been doing, I think, at the state level, but have been, at the national level, they have traditionally been more hesitant about government power, even when they have had certain goals. They've been willing over time to embrace more of it, but it feels to me like there's a big leap in the willingness to exert executive control and to grab power for the president, which the Heritage Foundation traditionally criticized. I'm used to reading a lot of conservative thinkers attacking people like Lyndon Johnson or Franklin Roosevelt for expanding executive power. And what you see in this text is a willingness to grab executive power. And I think the reason for that is both the desire to achieve this conservative Christian goal, this Christian nationalist goal, and also a sense that time is running out. If they don't do it now, they'll never have a chance.
Yeah, I mean, that's very much how I saw it. And, what I tried to explain to people and what you outline in your book as well is this is a radical transformation of our government. When on November 5th, I was sick for a week after this happened. I had a panic attack after the election because I knew what the election meant. I had read Project 2025. I'd been writing about it for months, and I knew this is Americans jettisoning democracy, whether they realize that or not. This is a transformation of our government that we will not be able to change next year if we have elections, and I hope we do. But it's something, and you spoke to this on a number of levels in your book, functionally, how the federal government is set to it will work in certain ways to prop up an executive that is essentially a dictator or a king, but it will not work in so many other ways that we've been used to it working without really understanding what it did for us. So can you talk about that a little bit, how this is changing our government fundamentally from the ground
Yeah.
up?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways, and we're starting to, I think, to see some of those. But there's this broad-based attack, I think, on the way the federal government has worked as we know it. So we can see this, for example, in the attempt to close the education department, which we've seen in the Trump administration, which comes directly out of Project 2025. And there's a desire not only to get on the one hand, to get the federal government sort of out of some of these businesses, but on the other hand, to use the power of the federal government to influence what can happen in schools. And I think there are these ideas that when you say them out loud, I worry that I can sound conspiracist, and I have to be like, no, I promise, I've read this, it's there. I mean, the stated desire is to be in a place where the federal government gives funding for schools, but has no control over them. And so we can imagine a situation of public religious schools or abolishing public schools entirely in favor of religious schools. Anything that would be legal at state level, they say, should be funded by the federal government for education expenses. And then this expands. I mean, we have obviously seen the attempt to fire lots of federal bureaucrats. We have seen the attempt to shift people in the civil service to political appointments, which makes them much easier to fire. Russell Vought, and I guess I should identify, Russell Vought is the head of the Office of Management and Budget, and also one of the kind of intellectual architects of Project 2025 and the author of a pivotal chapter that focuses on the executive branch.
And he's horrifying. He horrifies me.
And so there's that, and we've also seen he's behind this effort to switch people to political appointments. And then, I mean, something that I think is underappreciated is the way we see this assault on the independent agencies. So people think of them as the alphabet soup, the FCC, FTC, FEC, and since 1935, those have been sort of basically independent of the executive branch. Their heads or commissioners are appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate, and they function on their own. And Russell Vought and some of the people around him believe that this is unconstitutional. And if the president is the head of the executive branch and he's in the executive branch, he should have full control of those things. And so what you see is an attempt, quite explicit, to make these things political. And in the case of, the Federal Communications Commission, which is now led by Brendan Carr, who wrote the chapter in Project 2025 on the FCC. We see them moving to strip funding from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting for NPR and PBS. We see them threatening the broadcast licenses any major broadcasters who broadcast critically about Trump, such as Comcast, which owns NBC, or CBS, by demanding transcripts of interviews and sort of bullying them on that level, threatening mergers. So there is, what we watch, what we're able to watch, our entertainment and our news, what we get in our classrooms. There are all these ways that I think it just affects daily life in a really important way. The way we receive our healthcare, especially if we're in rural areas, the kind of services we might receive. I worry that things like this seem really abstract and like a matter of government policy. And I think that it's really important to recognize how much they can affect people's daily lives. And that's something that I think you recognized really early about Project 2025. And I'm interested in when sort of how you came upon it at the end of 2023, and then decided to start writing about it.
Well, an agent approached me in late 2022 and wanted me to write a memoir about growing up in Christian nationalism with a narcissist mother. And I said no. I pitched him several other books. I had a successful memoir, so he thought he could sell another memoir. So I said no. I pitched several other things. He rejected all of those. So I pitched him a book proposal. You've been through these things before, David, so you know how they work. And so in 4 hours, he said, yes, I'll take this. But then there were other books that were similar. I hadn't sold enough books. And you know how a lot of people here probably know how the publishing industry works. So by November of 2023, that book had been rejected. And I was really at a place as a writer where I was like, I don't know what I'm going to do now. And so I picked up Project 2025 and started reading it. I had been hearing about it, little things about it, and I downloaded the introduction and read it. And my husband will tell people I was reading things out loud to him and going, these are Bible verses in here. Do you get that out of it? No, I don't. My husband was brought up very differently from me. So, and I was like hyperventilating and freaking out and going, this is just the most horrible thing I've ever read. And so I persevered and read the whole thing, carried it around in like 5 dog, clip. I think I still have it somewhere marked up and scribbled on, and it's all a mess now. And so I actually had to read the paper copy and make notes about how I wanted to write about it. And so I launched my Substack late January of 2024. It was initially called How Project 2025 Will F Your Life. And I thought maybe 100 people will read it. I have a New York Times bestselling memoir, but I've never had a huge following. So I thought nobody's really going to read this. This is something really different for me that I've never really wanted to talk about. But, some key people recognized what it was early on and promoted it. About 25,000 people follow it now. I wish it had been more than that. I wish I had been able to get more people to pay attention to it before the election. As you said yourself, talking about some of the things within Project 2025 sounds so crazy. It sounds like conspiracy theories. And so I had to overcome, especially with my initial audience, so, I'm not a crazy person. This is how I grew up. This is what I was taught. This is what these people believe. Maybe you don't know anybody who's like that, but really there are people like that. And so overcoming this skepticism that I think a lot of people have who've never been exposed to people in that world was part of the role that I played. And so I wanted to teach people how to recognize this language that they use, because they'll tell you to your face what they're going to do. And they understand what they're saying to their people, and their people understand it. But if you don't know really what they're saying, what it means, they're laughing at us behind our backs because they're like, we're telling them what we're doing, but they don't really understand what we're saying. And so I approached it with let's talk about what they're really saying here. So that because I speak evangelicalese, I was indoctrinated in that. So I'll just translate all that for you. So that was a lot of what I ended up doing. And Never thought I'd be doing this at this point in my life.
Something that I felt, I mean, I feel like I was late to this, and I've had lots of people saying you should have been reading Andra sooner, and I think that's true. And I think I think there's a blind spot in the media, and I think there's a few blind spots in the media. I think one, and I think this is very much true of the sort of coverage I did. I treated it as a traditional policy document, and so when I wrote about it, I would look through and see what they said. And I think, analyze that carefully. But it is so important, I think, to think of it as a whole integrated whole. You can't really break it into parts. And it's a whole, both in terms of we have a bunch of policies and we also have a plan for how we're going to make them happen. And then also we have these policies and they're in the service of this vision of society that we have. Um, and I very much shared the experience of reading it and having to like go tell my wife, like, you won't believe what am I reading this right? And
Yeah.
I do worry about sounding conspiracist. I think that, the media, despite the years that Christian conservatives and Christian nationalists have been an important part of the news, remain a little bit. We're not good at covering it. I think there's either an exoticization or else a failure to understand, and both of those lead us to not serving our audiences
Yeah.
very well.
I mean, I'm not a journalist and I'm not trained to do that. I'm more of an advocate talking from my life experience. So I can't do what you do. And you don't have the experience that I have to be able to recognize these things when you see them. Stephanie McGrumman did a really good job in The Atlantic writing about Vance Balter. She used the word radicalized one time. I was very excited. I would love to see more of that. And that's what I've been writing about recently is the New York Times since 1851 can use radical Islamist, radicalized Muslim extremist, those kinds of terms almost 4,000 times in separate 4,000 different articles almost, and over 3,500 times in different articles since 9/11. Since 2012, they've used Christian extremist, radicalized Christian, and etc. 10 times.
I'm so glad I'm so glad you brought that up. I think
don't want to say that.
Yeah, radical is such an important way to think about this, I think. And I don't think it's necessarily even one that the people behind Project 2025 would reject. I think they are self-consciously radical in this. They are saying, I mean, Russell Vought says we're not living in a constitutional order anymore, and so they're saying we don't have to follow the old rules. We're going to do things differently. We're not going to treat things the way they were. We're not going to treat conservative dogma the way it was. And so I think it's radical in that sense. And I have tried. I am sure I've slipped up, but I've really tried in talking about Project 2025 to describe it not as a conservative project, but as a radical one, because I don't think it's conservative. It is it's counter to a lot of the sort of more libertarian ideas we associate with the the American right, but it's also counter to any sort of common sense vision of conservatism. I mean, this is about tearing down institutions. It's about getting rid of things the way they were. It simply is radical.
It's a recipe to me for a bunch of people who say they don't want big government. It's a recipe for huge government. It's a huge expansion of the government's involvement in our everyday lives, whether people realize that yet or not. So, even the places where they talk about, well, you think you live in a blue state, so I'm going to be okay, and abortion's going to be legal, and same-sex marriage is going to be fine, and my transgender children are going to be okay. And no, someone like Russ Vought is so horrifying because he is very intelligent. He's very strategic. He knows how the government works and he knows how to get things done and work with people. And he's also a radicalized Christian nationalist extremist. And so he understands both sides of that, and how to make this transition into a Christian nationalist government, which he is on the record as saying he wants to have. He believes that nobody should serve in government who's not a Christian nationalist. He believes we are a Christian nation and that we should be living that way. I made myself watch, and I don't know if you watched the hidden interview that the British group did with him. I suffered through that for an hour and had PTSD. I mean, men like him truly give me PTSD. But I mean, he vibrates, if you watch it, with this sense of rightness about what he is doing. And at one point was really angry that he was being told that he couldn't be as open about how much he wants the government to be a Christian government, because people were telling him it was too soon to do that. So now he's got this job where he's going to do that. And I don't think a lot of Americans are prepared for what that means. You know,
You spoke earlier about how they will tell you what they're going to do, and I think something that sticks with me a lot from Vote is, although many people who we would describe as Christian nationalists and who have been described as Christian nationalists disavow that term. There's an interview, and I'm sure you know this, but from I think 2023, could be wrong, where Vote says, yeah, the left calls me a Christian nationalist. They think that's a pejorative, but I think that's right. I'm a Christian and I'm a nationalist. That is my ideology. And he's very much open about that.
Yeah, I mean, calling most of them radicalized Christian nationalist extremists, they take it as a compliment. I mean, when I was growing up in my church, people would say, if somebody calls me crazy for Jesus, then, that's a compliment. I'm happy about that. So I don't think it's wrong for our media to shy away from talking about that. We're happy to call Muslims that in the media, to the point that I feel like some Americans, when they hear the word Muslim, automatically think extremist, radical. And that's not even remotely what that religion is about. But because it's been written about that way so much, that's what we think of. And most Christians are not Christian nationalists. We're talking about an extremist version of Christian nationalism in both Catholicism and Protestantism. And, I have a lot of very devout Christians following my work and help them educate, because a lot of Christians are just like, I don't even know what that is. So it's really important that more Americans understand what this is and what it could mean for them.
So, you mentioned earlier, you identify as an advocate and not a journalist. I get asked a lot, what should people do? And, I think from my perspective as a journalist, there's a couple of things. One is, I think it's really important for people to understand what is in Project 2025. I think a lot of people are caught off guard by what is happening and how quickly it's happening. And, I wouldn't say that I am different from that, but I do think knowing that there is a plan and knowing that they're following it has been really helpful to me. I often, it feels like every day I can wake up and look at the headlines and say, yes, that's in such and such a chapter. And I think that's really important. And I think understanding this ideology behind it is important. But so, that said, I feel like I don't have good answers. I'm curious from your point of view, what do you think Americans should do if they're worried about this, if they're troubled? What are some things you would recommend?
Well, obviously, they should try to learn what Project 2025 is. They can read your book. They can access my Substack. They can ask ChatGPT about it. I mean, there are a lot of ways, however they learn, and I can't dictate that for people. I mean, I wrote essentially a 900-page Project 2025 size book about Project 2025. So, that's a lot to ask somebody to go back and read now. But absolutely, people should know what this is and should get out of the mindset of, well, that won't ever happen here. They'll never do that. I mean, how many times have you heard that?
Oh, yeah.
Kind of, yeah.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I remember back in the fall writing a story where Democratic polling firms were asking people about Project 2025, and it was wildly unpopular. And they would ask people about the specific things in there, and those things were wildly unpopular. And then they would ask, do you think Trump will do these things? and nobody thought he would do it. They just didn't believe it. Either they thought he wouldn't follow through, or they thought these things were overblown, or I don't know what. But there is this sort of credibility gap, and now we're seeing that it absolutely is real, and it's happening right now.
Mhm. What do you think? I mean, do you think they're on schedule?
I think it's interesting. I think they're ahead of schedule in some ways. I
And in
think
some ways behind. Yeah, I agree.
right, like Elon Musk, I think supercharged a lot of their assault on
Mhm.
the bureaucracy. But it's been striking to see. I think they're slow. I mean, for example, on abortion, they have not moved as quickly as I thought they might. And I don't I think they will. It's clearly so important to them. It's so at
Mhm.
the heart of their vision that I don't think it's going to fall by the wayside. But I think it's a delay thing. I don't know. How do you assess it?
I think overall they're a little bit behind schedule. I think they wanted to have the bulk of this done by July 4th. Um, and we can thank the judicial branch largely for what they're behind schedule on. The Democratic Party is AWOL. They have, there are certainly individual politicians who have been fighting hard and doing what they can, but there's no coordination. There's no telling us what to do.
Does it
I
feel
mean,
to
we
you like
really,
the Democrats still haven't read it? I still feel like they haven't read it.
and it's so frustrating to me because, last summer I got the people at Lincoln Square, at Lincoln Project, got me in front of Jamie Raskin. And I talked to him about it. And I was like, I will come to Washington. I am in Europe and I will fly to Washington and sit with your people in advance of the DNC and talk about this and help you understand what's in this because it's horrifying. And I never heard from them again. And so, as a grassroots person, and I mean, gobs of grassroots Democratic people will say things like that. They just really don't know how to use their grassroots. And so this is something that we're really going to have to work on ourselves and work on fighting ourselves. I do feel like they're behind, but I do feel like they can accomplish what they want to. They planned for 50 years and
Yeah,
they're
I think
very energized.
that's a great point. They are planning on a really long timeline. They're thinking way past Trump, and I think that's something that's important to
Mhm,
remember. But they also know these things are really unpopular, and that's one reason they said, we need to get as much done as we can in the first 100 days,
mhm,
because they had to
mhm,
have the element of surprise. Because if the
mhm.
American people know what's going on, I think these things are really unpopular. So it's important to speak up on them.
Liz, you popped in.
I popped in because we have so many questions. It's just astounding. It's just a flood of questions. And this conversation has obviously inspired a lot of people and terrified a lot of people. Um, but one question that comes up is what is the relationship of the people that have devised this project 2025? What is their view of Trump? Do they view him as a useful idiot?
I think so. I
Yes,
mean, I
they
think
do.
maybe useful idiot would be strong, but something like that. I think they recognize, I think there's a couple things. They recognize that Trump has a relatively narrow set of interests. He wants tariffs, he wants to close the borders, he wants to stop immigration, but there are a lot of things that he just doesn't care about. And they recognize that they could fill that space because those are the things that they care about most. So you see them, I mean, even in Project 2025, there's a sort of debate on tariffs because I think they are still at heart fiscal conservatives of a sort, or small government conservatives, and free traders, but they realize they can't win on that. So they're willing to give in on tariffs in exchange for being able to have their way on things like education or abortion or family structure, health and human services. And so there's a little bit of a symbiosis there. And what Trump gets is, people who are motivated and willing to serve him. Um, and he gets control of things like DOJ for carrying out his retribution. But exactly like Andra said, they are working on a 50-year timeline. So Trump is a really important tool for them to get where they want. But he is not the end of the story for them.
Okay.
I've always said that he doesn't matter. I've gone that far. The people behind him are so focused on what they want. And he creates the reality TV show that keeps people distracted and keeps people outraged. And that's useful. for them. And so, I don't personally think he matters a lot in the long term. What they want to accomplish long term has very little to do with him.
Well, I don't want to drag on. One little thing I would add is I think they have, in some ways, Trump-proofed some of their plans by focusing on getting the right bureaucrats in, not at the secretarial level, but the people you don't know about, people you don't hear about, who even if the secretary is underprepared or distracted or there for the glamour, there are people there who are loyalists who are going to be doing the work for them.
Yes. And it goes a number of people deep in this regime.
One thing that question that has come up in a couple of different ways is with regard to this Christian nationalism. It seems like sort of an Old Testament approach to Christianity as opposed to the New Testament, more about love and forgiveness and sympathy and charity. Can you elaborate on that a little bit?
So Christian nationalists, I like to say they use Jesus as a fire escape. They're washed in the blood, and then they worship Old Testament, vengeful, angry, smitey God. They love Old Testament God. And so a lot of the things that they talk about in terms of how they would make laws conform to the Bible are drawn from the Old Testament. There's even a group of fringe, or not so fringe anymore, unfortunately, Christian nationalist men who are advocating that we actually apply Old Testament punishments from Exodus, Numbers, Leviticus, to specific things. Like if someone commits adultery, they should be publicly stoned to death. So, and that sounds insane, but there are actually people in the United States right now who are radicalized enough to believe that that's what we should be doing. So a lot of their underpinnings first come from Genesis and their interpretation of the creation story, which they take literally. And so a lot of their anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, women should be subservient, all comes from that. And they interpret that stuff literally. They believe that literally happened. They believe this is God's plan. And then they go to Leviticus, where old smitey God tells the Israelites that, if people are committing sexual immorality in your town, if two people are committing adultery, you need to confront them and make them stop having adultery and stone them to death, or I'm going to judge your whole town. So this notion that God is judging America for rejecting him and its sexual immorality. And they use pornography in Project 2025. That's what they're calling sexual immorality. So, but if you don't know that, you just hear, oh, they're coming after my Pornhub. But it's not even just remotely that. It's living together without being married. It's having premarital sex. It's masturbating in your bedroom, because that, it's all these things that aren't wrong, but they believe they are, and they believe God is judging us for that. So that's how they see God, and they see themselves as God's avengers. Government is God's avenger on wrongdoers, and government doesn't have to forgive people. We individually do, but government doesn't. So if they run the government, then they can be God's avengers on wrongdoers and decide how to judge people and punish people for doing what they deem to be wrong.
I know it's pretty fresh, but several people have mentioned the Supreme Court's decision today about the Tennessee law on providing treatment to transgender minors. And do you think that this is part of that, or this is a reflection of that kind of belief?
What do you think, David?
I think definitely. I mean, I think it functions in a couple ways. I think it is both something that they believe in strongly. There's an obsession throughout the Mandate for Leadership document with gender ideology, which they mean anything that is separate from traditional gender roles and a strict binary division of sexes. anything that to them smacks of wokeness, which they don't define, but I think you can kind of see what they're gesturing at, and certainly, gender affirming care for minors, they would say is both a manifestation of gender ideology and of wokeness. So it functions in that way, but I also think it functions as a useful political wedge. Um, they understand that there is, for example, substantial public support at this point for same-sex marriage, but they oppose it themselves. And so by talking, and Trump grasps this too, by talking about trans issues, which are still much more contested, it's a way to open up the possibility of pushing on so many of these things, of insisting on strict gender division, insisting on women being subservient, on cracking down on not just trans people, but any gay people. So it's kind of the tip of the spear, I think.
Okay.
Yeah, I agree.
So, gosh, there's so many. Let me go through these. One, you touched on it before with regard to Russell Vought. Given that Musk has left the stage, and Vought is now seems to be in the driver's seat of DOGE, how do you think he's going to utilize this new position of his, and how scared should we be?
I'm curious to see how much Doge sort of continues to exist as an independent entity now. I think in a lot of ways, Russell Vought was already driving Elon Musk. And Musk is not somebody who knows a great deal about government, as we saw in the way he approached things. And so Musk, Vought could kind of point him towards what he wanted to destroy, and let Musk do that. And so we've seen a lot of that. And sometimes he uses maybe a blunter instrument than Vought would have, but the basic point comes across. What Vought realized and wrote about in Project 2025 is that using OMB, he could control many parts of the government. He talks about it as an air traffic control system for the president, and he complains that in the past, departments of the government have managed to sort of push their priorities up to the White House. But he says, no, I'm going to use this to push these things down through the White House. I'm going to use this. I'm going to use the management part of Office of Management and Budget, to take control of hiring, to get rid of as many members of the civil service as I can, to get rid of the civil service as we know it. And so I think that the kind of DOGE stuff is going to be wrapped into Vought's general OMB plan. And I think for all the reasons we discussed earlier, people should be very nervous about that.
Yeah, I mean, Ruth Ben-Ghiat has been writing about this some and has said that DOGE is the federal government now, that they're really the same thing, and Vought will be ruthlessly efficient, where Musk was just kind of scattershot at implementing what he wants to implement. And to me, and this doesn't get addressed in Project 2025, but it kind of does. I think this is we'll transform the federal government, and then we're going to push this down to state and local governments, and all of you are going to get on board with this. And whether you're a blue state or a red state or whatever, if you want federal funding, if you want federal assistance, if you don't want us replacing your district attorneys and deciding that certain politicians can't serve and whatever, we're going to push this down and force that on you. So he will be very good at that. He'll be very good.
Andra talked earlier about like big government, and I think this is another example of that. There's all these places where they, despite the traditional Republican Party insistence on local control and on states' rights, there is this willingness to use the federal government to bully states, to insist that states do things, to insist that counties and cities do things. It's a really coercive flexing of muscle, big government isn't just the head count. It's what you're doing with the government, and these are, I think, very clearly big government.
In fact, Trump threatened Gavin Newsom with that just today. So, but sticking with the vote question, there's been, and moving on to try to be sort of constructive in the face of this juggernaut, right? How is it that Vought can be that the message that Vought is as terrifying as he is, how can that be conveyed in a way that reaches these people, or can it?
I mean, I think one thing that makes Vought so effective is that he looks and sounds like a like a technocrat. I mean, he looks and sounds like a budget guy. And he's got little glasses and a neatly trimmed beard. He wears a conservative suit. And it's only when you start hearing the things he says about, putting the bureaucrats in trauma, or about how we're no longer living in a constitutional order, that you start to grasp just how radical it is. I think that's a real challenge of conveying his radicalism.
Yeah.
I also, think it's important for journalists to understand he does not want to be in the spotlight. Stephen Miller loves to get up in front of a camera and talk. J.D. Vance, as bad as he is at it, loves to get up in front of a camera and talk. Russ Vought never wants to talk in front of a camera. He does not want us talking about him right now. So the more we talk about him, especially things that he's embarrassed about, like he's divorced and he's really embarrassed about it, some of these personal things, he does not like that, and it rattles him. He doesn't handle it well because he doesn't want to be talked about. So the more we talk about him, the better. That's what I think. And help more people understand who and what he is.
Well, it's trying to sort of think about positive ways to address this situation in which we find ourselves as a country. Would be any advice that you would have would be very helpful. And, it kind of begs how is it that we can make sure that we have an election in 2026? Because there's all this talk about the midterms, but the midterms need to happen. And so how your thoughts on that?
I mean, I think that the unpopularity of a lot of these things is so important. And I know that sounds really basic, but it is so important. And the way that when people express that, the people who you can affect, who Trump doesn't care. He's not, well, who knows? Maybe he's running for election. We don't know. But if he is, presumably he's not interested in running in a free and fair election, since it would be unconstitutional. Russell Vought isn't running in an election. Members of Congress are. And one of the few times I can think where we saw members of Congress object to something was very early in this administration, when Russ Vought attempted to impound funds. And impoundment is, the idea that Congress appropriates funds, but the executive branch doesn't have to spend that all. They treating it as a ceiling rather than a floor. And so Vought tried to impound funds using OMB. And just a few Republican senators spoke up and said, hey, wait a second. You can't do that. That's money coming to our states that we appropriated. And all they had to do was issue statements, and the White House backed down. And so if only a few Republicans can do that, I think that's something to think about. And so people need to put pressure on their members of Congress to say, we don't want this. This is really unpopular. And if you do these things, you are going to lose your seat, because that is one thing that people respond to. And we have seen really remarkable public disapproval and outcry over things in Republican districts. And I think that's powerful. And I think that the continuing to keep that volume up is essential. And it's essential to, safeguarding democracy in terms of making sure there are elections in a year.
I'm going to say a couple of things. First, I think it's really important that you're talking to your elected officials daily about something, calling them, going to their office if you have a local office, and letting them know, today I'm here to talk about this issue that I really care about. And tomorrow I'm going to come back and you're going to get sick of seeing me, or you're going to get sick of hearing from me. It is really important that we do that. And this is going to sound depressing, but just hang with me. Russ Vought has said the constitutional order is done. They mean that. And I accepted that when the election happened. I grieved that my country was done, that my country as I knew it was over. I cried about that. I got sick over that. I mean, I had the time that I grieved that. And so I'm in a very different place now. We have an opportunity here. It may not happen by the time I die, to actually write a constitution and create a multicultural, multi-plural democracy where it's not just a bunch of rich white men, some of whom think it's okay to own people, and the rest who think, well, I'll form a country with these people who think it's okay to own people. And that's really still what we're fighting about. All people really aren't equal. And so we have a chance to do that. And that's going to be something that's going to happen at the grassroots level in our communities by working together face to face and getting, that means we have to create communities and ways of getting things done that exist outside of the system that they're going to try to force us to live in. And it's not a short-term project. And I think that's what Americans are looking for, but they've worked for this for 50 years. And we're not going to defeat it in 6 months. And I'm not going to tell anybody we are, because that's just a lie. This is something that we're going to have to dig in and work together to defeat. And it may take 5 years, it may take 10 years, it may take the rest of our lives. But it's an opportunity that I'm really excited about, because I would love to see a country that actually believes all people are created equal and treats them like that.
I think Andra's saying something really profound there. I think it's really important for people to not be asking, how can we get things back to the way they were in 2015 or in 1995 or in 1975? Pick a year, maybe not 1975. But how can we get back to that? And I think that was a mistake that what Mike Podhorter calls the anti-MAGA majority made in 2020. Okay, we're going to get things back to normal. And maybe it was understandable to do that then. That's not the answer now. The question is not to return things the way they were. It's to what can be built that's better. And I think that is what people need to think about. And that is, I think, one thing that that is really impressive about Project 2025, and something that the right has done well for a very long time, is they think hard about what they want to do, and they're willing to play a very long game. We saw this on overturning Roe. We've seen this on gun laws, and to some extent, that's true of Project 2025 too. The other thing I'd say, sometimes people ask, how can those of us who oppose this, make a Project 2029? And I think part of the answer is not just to sort of create a mirror image, but so much of this is about executive power and making one person so powerful. And if you're worried about that, the way to fix that is to make sure that there are strong checks and balances. And what that means is congressional reform. The authors of Project 2025 write that Congress is broken and can't do its job, and they're right. Congress is broken. It's a real problem. And so to make things better, we need a Congress that functions, and that's what we need to keep the president in check as well.
I agree.
And last question, and then I'm going to start to wrap things up. Do you think, what is the effect of all the public protests that we've seen in the last since the No Kings rallies and other marches? What do you think the effect of that is?
I personally think those need to be happening every day. I think we need a lot more of those in a sustained manner for them to make a difference. You may see it differently, David, but that's what I think. I think they can have an impact, but we need a lot more people in them.
Yeah, I think they are. I think they're really important. I mean, we have seen between the George Floyd protests, the Women's March in 2017, and then this, 3 of the 5 or 6 largest demonstrations in American history have taken place while Trump is president. They have often been against the things Trump is doing. And something that some good political scientists have been pointing out is these things, if everyone now agrees that everyone supports Martin Luther King, but if you look at the public polling from the 60s, that wasn't the case. We see much more widespread support for what's going on. The American people are not in favor of these things. And if they speak up, I think that's really powerful.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. And I like to end on a somewhat of a hopeful note. I want to thank everybody that's attended. I want to thank you two very much. I mean, from each of your perspectives, you bring so much to this discussion. And to as somebody who, as punishment for my sins, read the whole damn 2020 Project 2025, I was terrified, and I feel vindicated in that by listening to the two of you, but also hopeful because you really are conveying a very powerful image that is great for us all to hear. And I would commend everybody to read your book. I would commend everyone to look at your Substack, and just keep calling and getting in touch with your elected officials, and maybe read Project 2025. So at any rate, Thank you very, very much.